I'll bet $100,000 that our waitress doesn't understand a single word of Chinese. The sentence landed on the polished marble floor like a crystal glass slipping from careless fingers. Conversation stalled. Chopsticks paused halfway to elegant porcelain plates. Even the soft melody drifting from the grand piano seemed to hesitate beneath the golden chandeliers of Jade Imperial, Beverly Hills' most exclusive Chinese restaurant. Around the private dining table, executives dressed in tailored Italian suits exchanged amused glances while several investors smirked behind expensive wine glasses. A few quietly reached for their phones, sensing that an entertaining moment was about to unfold. Ethan Brooks leaned comfortably into his leather chair with the relaxed confidence of a man who had spent 20 years turning bold risks into profitable victories. At 42, he was one of Southern California's most celebrated self-made millionaires, the founder of a software company whose latest expansion into Asia had placed him on magazine covers beside celebrities, politicians, and business icons. Success had taught Ethan many valuable lessons, but humility had never been one of them. Tonight's dinner wasn't simply another corporate gathering. It was the final negotiation before signing a partnership worth nearly $250 million with one of Shanghai's fastest-growing technology firms. Every smile carried financial weight. Every sentence could influence the future of thousands of employees. Every translated word mattered. Across the room, Naomi Carter moved quietly between tables with practiced grace, carrying a silver tea service that reflected the warm glow of hanging lanterns. Her uniform was immaculate. Her posture was calm. Her expression revealed nothing beyond quiet professionalism. Guests barely acknowledged her existence except when they needed another cup of jasmine tea or another plate removed. To most of them, she blended naturally into the elegant background, another hard-working waitress invisible beneath polished hospitality. Ethan barely looked at her before making his wager. His eyes remained fixed on his business partners as he chuckled. "Go ahead," he continued confidently. "Ask her anything. Mandarin. She'll smile politely, nod, and have absolutely no idea what you're saying." Laughter rippled around the table. One executive whispered something in Mandarin that drew another round of amused reactions. Someone raised an eyebrow toward Naomi as though waiting for confusion to appear across her face. It never did. She simply placed a porcelain teapot beside the center platter, carefully adjusted a tiny teacup that had drifted slightly off-center, and continued serving each guest with steady hands. If anyone had looked closely, they might have noticed something unusual. Every time Mandarin echoed through the room, Naomi's eyes shifted ever so slightly toward the speaker. Not with uncertainty, with recognition. Across the table, one elderly Chinese executive remained completely silent. Unlike the others, he wasn't smiling. His gaze followed Naomi with growing curiosity, as though he had noticed a detail everyone else had overlooked. The room believed it was witnessing the beginning of an expensive joke. None of them realized they were standing only seconds away from watching every assumption in that luxurious dining room quietly collapse. Naomi Carter had learned years ago that the easiest way to move unnoticed through a room full of powerful people was to never give them a reason to look twice. Every evening, she tied her neatly pressed black apron with the same quiet routine, tucked a small notebook into her pocket, smoothed the wrinkles from her white shirt, and reminded herself that dignity never depended on someone else's opinion. At 27, she had worked at Jade Imperial for just over 11 months. Her coworkers knew she was dependable, calm under pressure, and somehow able to remember every regular customer's favorite tea without writing anything down. They assumed she had always worked in restaurants. They assumed she needed the tips. They assumed she had little interest in the conversations taking place inside the private dining rooms where billion-dollar partnerships were often born over carefully prepared meals. Those assumptions never bothered her. Sometimes being underestimated gave a person the freedom to observe everything. Long before the first guest arrived each evening, Naomi walked through the quiet dining room while the crystal glasses still sparkled beneath the morning light. She checked every table, adjusted every chair until it sat perfectly aligned, and greeted every member of the kitchen staff by name. Respect, she believed, was not reserved for executives wearing custom suits. It belonged equally to the dishwasher finishing a 12-hour shift and the hostess welcoming strangers with a smile. That belief had been shaped years earlier by someone most people would never meet. Her grandfather had spent more than 3 decades teaching languages at a public university before retiring to a small neighborhood outside Seattle. Every Saturday morning, he filled their modest home with books written in English, Mandarin, Spanish, and French. While other children watched cartoons, Naomi listened to conversations from international radio stations and repeated unfamiliar sounds until every tone became natural. He often smiled before telling her, "A new language is not another way to speak. It is another way to respect another human being." Those words stayed with her long after he was gone. Scholarships eventually carried Naomi across the Pacific, where she completed part of her international business studies in Beijing. She fell in love not only with the language, but also with the culture, the history, and the small expressions that never appeared in textbooks. She learned that a pause during negotiation could carry as much meaning as a sentence, and that listening often impressed people more than speaking. After graduation, she returned home expecting to begin a corporate career, but reality had different plans. Student loans, a slowing job market, and family responsibilities led her somewhere unexpected. Serving tables was never part of the dream, yet she refused to see it as failure. Every shift became another classroom. Every guest revealed something about leadership, ambition, generosity, or pride. While others carried plates, Naomi quietly collected lessons. Tonight felt different from the moment she saw the reservation list. The delegation from Shanghai had arrived exactly on schedule, their company famous for rewarding integrity as much as innovation. As she refilled another porcelain teapot, she noticed the elderly executive still watching her with calm, thoughtful eyes. Unlike everyone else, he was not entertained by the laughter around the table. He seemed to be waiting, not for someone to make another joke, but for someone to reveal who they truly were. The laughter lingered just long enough for confidence to become carelessness. Ethan Brooks leaned back with the easy smile of a man who believed the room belonged to him, casually swirling the amber liquid inside his crystal glass, while one of his vice presidents grinned and said, "Come on, this should be interesting." Another executive folded a $100 bill and placed it beside his plate as if the evening had quietly transformed into entertainment. Across the polished table, the delegation from Shanghai exchanged subtle glances that were harder to read. Some smiled politely, others simply watched, but none of them joined the growing chorus of jokes. The elderly executive sitting nearest the center remained completely still, his fingers resting lightly on a porcelain teacup, as though he were studying something far more important than the conversation itself. Naomi continued serving without changing her pace. She carefully filled each guest's cup with fresh dragon well tea, making certain not a single drop touched the white linen tablecloth. Years of discipline had taught her that composure was contagious. The calmer she remained, the more uncomfortable careless people eventually became. Ethan noticed her silence and mistook it for uncertainty. He smiled wider. "You know what?" he said, loud enough for every guest to hear. "Let us make this a little more fun." Several heads turned immediately. Nearby servers slowed their footsteps without appearing obvious. Even the restaurant manager standing near the entrance sensed that something unusual was unfolding inside the private dining room. Ethan rested both elbows lightly on the table and looked directly at Naomi for what felt like the first time that evening. "If you can honestly understand everything we have been saying in Mandarin tonight, I will wire $100,000 into any bank account you choose before dessert is served." Another wave of laughter rolled across the table. Someone softly applauded the challenge. One investor joked that they should increase the amount because there was no chance the waitress could win. Ethan nodded confidently. "Fair enough," he replied. "But if you cannot, you simply smile and admit you were lost the whole time." Naomi met his eyes for only a brief moment before lowering her gaze respectfully. "Is there anything else you would like this evening, sir?" she asked in calm, flawless English. Her answer surprised a few guests because she had ignored the challenge completely. Ethan interpreted her professionalism as surrender. "See," one executive whispered. "She is avoiding it." Yet across the table, the elderly Chinese executive slowly placed his teacup onto its saucer with deliberate precision. The quiet click echoed more loudly than anyone expected. He finally spoke, not in English, but in clear, measured Mandarin. His tone was gentle, almost grandfatherly, And unlike the playful comments from the others, every syllable carried genuine curiosity. The room immediately fell silent. Everyone looked toward Naomi, expecting the familiar polite smile that usually followed words a waitress could not understand. Instead, she remained perfectly still. Her eyes lifted slowly toward the elderly gentleman, and for the first time that evening, a faint smile appeared across her face. It was not the smile of someone caught in an impossible situation. It was the smile of someone who had been patiently waiting for the conversation to become worthy of an honest answer. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The silence settled over the private dining room with a weight no amount of wealth could lift. Naomi placed the silver teapot gently onto the warming stand before turning toward the elderly executive. Then, in smooth, natural Mandarin, she answered his question with the relaxed confidence of someone greeting an old friend rather than responding to a challenge. Her pronunciation was effortless, every tone precise, every expression culturally natural instead of mechanically memorized. The elderly gentleman's eyes brightened immediately. A warm smile slowly crossed his face as he replied with another sentence, this one noticeably more complex than the first. Naomi listened without interrupting. When he finished, she answered again, matching not only his words but also his gentle humor. Soft laughter came from the elderly executive himself, genuine this time, followed by approving nods from the members of the Shanghai delegation. Around the table, the American executives stared in complete disbelief. The smiles they had worn only moments earlier faded into puzzled silence. Ethan Brooks blinked once, then twice, as though waiting for someone to explain what had just happened. Instead, the conversation continued without him. The elderly executive spoke again, asking Naomi where she had learned Mandarin. She answered that she had studied in Beijing during college, and that one of the greatest gifts her grandfather ever gave her was teaching her to respect cultures before trying to speak their languages. The elderly gentleman laughed softly again before complimenting her accent, saying it carried traces of northern China but had been softened by years in the United States. Naomi smiled appreciatively and admitted that he had noticed something very few native speakers ever recognized. Several members of the delegation exchanged impressed glances. One of them quietly remarked that even many international business professionals struggled to speak with such natural rhythm. The room remained frozen. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He had expected surprise, perhaps even embarrassment. Instead, he was watching his own guests engage more warmly with a waitress than they had with anyone at the table all evening. One vice president leaned toward Ethan and whispered, "How is this possible?" Ethan did not answer because he did not have one. The restaurant manager near the entrance stood perfectly still, trying not to appear obvious while listening from a respectful distance. Even the nearby servers exchanged quick glances before returning to their duties, sensing they were witnessing something that would be talked about long after the dinner ended. Then the elderly executive slowly turned toward Ethan and spoke in English for the first time since arriving. "Mr. Brooks," he said with a calm smile, "your waitress did not simply understand our language. She understood our culture. There is a very important difference." The words landed far more heavily than anyone expected. Ethan forced a polite smile, but it no longer carried the confidence that had filled the room minutes earlier. Before he could respond, another executive from Shanghai looked toward Naomi and politely asked, in Mandarin, whether she would be willing to settle a small disagreement that had emerged during the earlier discussion. Naomi hesitated respectfully, glancing first toward her manager and then back toward the guests. The manager gave a subtle nod. She listened carefully as the executive explained the point of confusion. When he finished, Naomi did not rush to answer. She considered every word with thoughtful precision, because she knew that sometimes the smallest misunderstanding was capable of changing the direction of an entire business relationship. Naomi listened without interrupting, her attention fixed not only on the words being spoken, but also on the subtle expressions surrounding them. Experience had taught her that successful negotiations rarely failed because of vocabulary alone. They failed because people assumed the same sentence carried the same meaning in every culture. When the Shanghai executive finished explaining the disputed clause, Naomi politely asked one brief question in Mandarin. The elderly executive answered immediately, and a quiet smile appeared on her face. She understood the misunderstanding. Turning first to the Chinese delegation, She carefully summarized what Ethan's team had intended to communicate. Then she faced the American executives and explained the hidden meaning behind the original Mandarin phrasing. The translation itself is accurate, she said calmly in English, but the intention is different. In this context, the wording suggests exclusive long-term control, rather than collaborative growth. They are not rejecting the partnership. They are concerned that the language sounds more possessive than cooperative. Every eye in the room shifted toward the professional interpreter hired for the evening. The interpreter quickly reviewed the printed documents before lowering his gaze with an embarrassed but respectful expression. She is correct, he admitted. The literal translation is accurate, but the business implication changes because of the cultural context. An uncomfortable silence settled over the table. Ethan reached for the contract and reread the highlighted paragraph that had already passed through multiple attorneys, consultants, and advisors. Until this moment, no one had questioned it. One executive from Shanghai nodded appreciatively before speaking in Mandarin again. Naomi translated without hesitation. He says they were beginning to wonder whether your company intended to dominate the partnership instead of building it together. That concern almost convinced them to postpone signing tonight. Ethan's confident posture slowly disappeared. For the first time that evening, he realized the dinner had never been about proving who could speak another language. It had always been about understanding people well enough to earn their trust. The elderly executive smiled warmly at Naomi before addressing the room in English once more. Language opens the door, he said. Respect invites people inside. Several members of the delegation nodded in agreement. Even the executives who had laughed earlier now sat quietly, absorbing the weight of those simple words. Ethan looked across the table at Naomi with an expression that no longer carried amusement. It carried curiosity, humility, and the uncomfortable awareness that he had judged someone long before learning her story. Would you mind, he asked carefully, showing us how you would rewrite that section? Naomi hesitated for only a moment before accepting. She picked up a pen, read the disputed paragraph one final time, and suggested a few carefully chosen revisions. The changes were surprisingly small. A handful of words shifted from ownership to partnership. A sentence emphasizing shared innovation replaced one that sounded overly controlling. When Naomi finished, she handed the document back with quiet confidence. The Shanghai delegation reviewed the revised wording together. Within moments, smiles spread naturally across their faces. The elderly executive placed the contract gently on the table and nodded with visible approval. Yes, he said. Now it sounds like two companies preparing to succeed together instead of one preparing to control the other. Around the room, the atmosphere changed completely. The tension that had quietly hovered over the dinner dissolved into genuine conversation. And for the first time that evening, the strongest voice in the room belonged not to the millionaire who had made the wager, but to the waitress everyone had underestimated. No one rushed to celebrate. The most important deals were never closed with applause alone. They were sealed through trust, and trust had quietly returned to the table one thoughtful sentence at a time. The revised contract circulated around the room as executives from both companies examined every adjustment. Questions that had sounded defensive only minutes earlier now became collaborative. Suggestions replaced objections. Smiles replaced guarded expressions. Naomi remained beside the table, hands folded neatly in front of her apron, never inserting herself into the discussion unless someone specifically invited her to speak. That quiet discipline impressed the Shanghai delegation almost as much as her command of their language. She understood something many professionals never did. Intelligence did not need to dominate a conversation in order to shape its outcome. After several minutes, the elderly executive carefully closed the contract folder and looked directly at Ethan Brooks. I believe we are ready, he said warmly. Not because the document became perfect, but because tonight we discovered something more valuable than perfect wording. Ethan nodded slowly. What is that? The elderly gentleman smiled. We discovered honesty. His answer lingered in the room long after he finished speaking. Ethan glanced toward Naomi again, this time seeing not a waitress standing beside the tea service, but a professional whose insight had quietly protected months of preparation. He remembered every joke, every assumption, every confident remark he had made before dinner, and each one now echoed back with uncomfortable clarity. The $100,000 wager suddenly felt insignificant compared with the partnership that had almost slipped away because of pride disguised as certainty. One by one, representatives from both companies signed the final agreement. Elegant fountain pens moved steadily across thick, cream-colored paper. Cameras belonging to the corporate communications teams captured polite handshakes and congratulatory smiles. The atmosphere had transformed completely. Earlier that evening, success had seemed dependent on impressive presentations and financial leverage. Now everyone understood that the turning point had come from a quiet woman carrying a silver teapot. As the final signature dried, the elderly executive stood from his chair. The rest of the delegation followed without hesitation. Ethan assumed another formal toast was about to begin. Instead, the elderly gentleman turned toward Naomi and gave a respectful bow of appreciation. It was simple, sincere, and completely unexpected. The other members of the delegation immediately followed his example. Several American executives instinctively rose from their seats as well. Within seconds, every person around the private dining table was standing. The room fell silent once again, but this silence carried admiration instead of anticipation. Naomi looked genuinely surprised. She returned the gesture with quiet humility, placing one hand over her heart before offering a respectful nod. She never looked triumphant. She never appeared proud of proving anyone wrong. Her expression reflected only gratitude that understanding had replaced misunderstanding. Ethan slowly stood with everyone else. His applause began softly before growing steadier. Soon the entire room joined him. Crystal glasses shimmered beneath the chandeliers while the sound of genuine respect filled the elegant dining room more powerfully than laughter ever had. Ethan waited until the applause faded before speaking. His voice no longer carried the playful confidence that had opened the evening. It carried something far rarer. "Miss Carter," he said sincerely, "I believe I owe you far more than an apology." Naomi met his eyes with the same calm expression she had carried since the beginning of the evening. "Respect is always enough to begin with," she answered gently. Those few words settled into Ethan's mind with greater force than any business lesson he had learned in his career, because for the first time in a very long time, the wealthiest man in the room realized that the greatest value he had witnessed all night could never be measured by the balance of a bank account. The dinner slowly returned to its elegant rhythm, but nothing about the room felt the same anymore. Conversations that had once revolved around market share, quarterly projections, and expansion strategies now carried a quieter tone, as though everyone had been reminded that the strongest business relationships were built long before a contract was signed. Naomi resumed her work exactly as she always had. She collected empty plates, refreshed teacups, and thanked each guest with the same warm professionalism she had shown from the beginning of the evening. She did not linger near the executives hoping for recognition. She did not retell what had happened. She simply returned to serving others with the quiet confidence of someone who never needed applause to understand her own worth. Ethan watched her from across the room with growing disbelief. The more he observed, the more he realized that her composure had never changed. She had carried herself with exactly the same dignity before anyone knew about her education, her experience, or her remarkable understanding of another culture. The applause had not transformed Naomi. It had only transformed everyone else's perception of her. That realization settled heavily in his mind. After dessert was served, Ethan quietly excused himself from another conversation and walked toward the restaurant manager, Linda Alvarez, who had spent nearly 15 years leading Jade Imperial with calm professionalism. "How long has Miss Carter worked here?" Ethan asked. Linda smiled knowingly. "Almost a year," she replied. "She has never been late, never complained, and somehow remembers details about guests that most people forget 5 minutes later." Ethan glanced toward Naomi again. "Did you know about her background?" Linda nodded. "Some of it. She never talks about herself unless someone asks. We only discovered she spoke several languages because she once helped an elderly tourist find his family after they became separated." Ethan shook his head slowly. "Why is someone with those qualifications serving tables?" Linda answered with quiet honesty. "Sometimes life takes intelligent people on unexpected paths. Character is easier to recognize than a job title." Those words struck Ethan almost as deeply as Naomi's earlier response. Throughout his career, he had reviewed thousands of resumes, searching for impressive credentials, prestigious universities, and influential recommendations. Yet tonight he had nearly overlooked extraordinary talent simply because it wore a restaurant uniform instead of an executive suit. Across the dining room, the elderly executive approached Naomi one final time before preparing to leave. Speaking in Mandarin, he thanked her not only for helping save the negotiation, but for reminding everyone that true communication always begins with respect. Naomi thanked him with equal warmth and wished him a safe journey home. Before walking away, he handed her a simple business card with both hands, following a tradition deeply rooted in courtesy. Naomi accepted it with the same respect, carefully reading his name before placing the card securely inside her notebook rather than slipping it casually into her apron pocket. The elderly gentleman smiled with visible appreciation. He had noticed the gesture immediately. Respect recognized respect. As guests slowly departed beneath the soft glow of the restaurant lights, Ethan remained standing near the entrance, watching Naomi thank every departing customer with the same sincere smile. Wealth had impressed him for years. Talent had earned his admiration countless times. But humility combined with excellence was something far rarer. For perhaps the first time since building his company, Ethan began wondering how many extraordinary people he had unknowingly walked past simply because he had been looking in the wrong direction. The last guests drifted toward the valet entrance beneath the warm California night, their conversations softer than when they had arrived, as though the evening had quietly rewritten more than a business agreement. Inside Jade Imperial, the dining room returned to its familiar rhythm. Staff cleared tables, folded linen napkins, and polished untouched glasses while the fragrance of jasmine tea still lingered gently in the air. Naomi carried a tray toward the service station, believing the evening had finally come to an end. She expected tomorrow to look exactly like today. Another shift, another uniform, another room full of strangers. She had no idea someone was walking toward her with a very different plan. Ethan Brooks stopped a few feet away and waited until she finished placing the last teacup onto the counter before speaking. There was no audience now. No executives. No cameras. No laughter. Only two people standing in a quiet restaurant after one unforgettable evening. "Miss Carter," he began, "I made a promise earlier tonight." Naomi looked at him with the same calm expression she had worn all evening. Ethan removed his phone, opened his banking application, and held it where she could clearly see the completed transfer authorization. $100,000. The amount matched his public wager exactly. "The transfer can be completed in less than 2 minutes," he said. "All I need is the account information you would like me to use." Naomi studied the screen briefly before shaking her head with a gentle smile. "Thank you," she replied, "but I cannot accept it." Ethan blinked in surprise. "You earned it." She nodded respectfully. "No, I earned my paycheck tonight. The money was offered because someone underestimated me. I do not want my value to be measured by a mistake someone else made." Ethan lowered the phone slowly, uncertain how to respond. Throughout his career, he had solved disagreements with bonuses, acquisitions, and generous settlements. Money had always been the fastest solution available to him. Yet standing before Naomi, he realized this was one problem money could not solve. She continued softly, never sounding judgmental. "If you truly want to honor your promise, there is something worth far more than $100,000. Ethan listened carefully. "The next time someone walks into one of your offices wearing a simple uniform, carrying a modest resume, or speaking with a different accent, give them the same respect you would give your biggest investor. You never know whose potential is standing in front of you." Her words settled over the quiet restaurant more powerfully than any applause from earlier that evening. Ethan slowly slipped his phone back into his jacket pocket. For the first time in years, he felt as though he was the one receiving an education instead of giving instructions. At that moment, Linda Alvarez approached with an envelope she had nearly forgotten to deliver. "Naomi," she said, smiling warmly. "One of the executives from Shanghai asked me to give you this before they left." Inside was a handwritten note and a business card from the elderly gentleman. The note was brief. "Talent opens opportunities. Character creates them. If your path ever leads to Shanghai again, our door will already be open." Naomi read the message quietly before placing it beside the business card in her notebook. She smiled, not because it promised a new opportunity, but because it reminded her of something her grandfather had once said. Respect always travels farther than pride. Ethan watched the exchange in thoughtful silence, realizing that the greatest reward Naomi received that evening was never the money he had offered. It was the trust she had earned without ever asking for recognition. 1 year later, the conference room overlooking downtown Los Angeles was filled with newly promoted managers attending Ethan Brooks's annual leadership summit. The walls displayed charts, growth strategies, and ambitious plans for another record-breaking year. But before anyone discussed profits or projections, Ethan walked to the front of the room carrying a simple black apron neatly folded across one arm. The room grew quiet. Most of the executives assumed it was part of a presentation about customer service. None of them knew the story behind it. Ethan placed the apron gently on the table and smiled. The most important business lesson I learned last year did not come from an executive, an investor, or a consultant, he said. It came from a waitress. Every person in the room looked up. Ethan shared the story exactly as it had happened. He admitted that he had confused confidence with wisdom. He admitted that he had judged someone before taking the time to understand her. Most importantly, he admitted that one quiet conversation had changed the way he interviewed candidates, promoted employees, and evaluated potential leaders. Since that evening, his company had removed unnecessary barriers from its hiring process, expanded mentorship opportunities for overlooked talent, and encouraged every executive to spend 1 day each quarter working alongside frontline employees. The results surprised everyone. Employee retention reached its highest level in company history. Customer satisfaction climbed steadily. Innovation improved because more voices were finally being heard. Respect, Ethan discovered, was not simply the right thing to offer people. It was also remarkably good leadership. Across the country, Naomi Carter's journey had continued in ways she never imagined. Months after that unforgettable dinner, she accepted an invitation to consult on international partnership training for several American companies expanding into Asia. She still carried the same notebook inside her bag, including the carefully preserved business card from the elderly executive in Shanghai. She often smiled whenever she saw it because it reminded her that opportunities rarely arrived with loud announcements. Sometimes they arrived disguised as ordinary conversations. Despite her growing reputation, Naomi never forgot Jade Imperial. She visited often, greeting former co-workers by name, thanking Linda Alvarez for believing in her long before anyone else noticed her abilities, and enjoying a quiet cup of jasmine tea near the same dining room where everything had changed. The staff always welcomed her like family because they understood something the world sometimes forgot. Success should never erase gratitude. One afternoon, while leaving the restaurant, Naomi noticed a young employee nervously carrying a tray for what appeared to be her first shift. The young woman apologized after nearly dropping a teacup. Naomi simply smiled, steadied the tray with one hand, and quietly said, "Do not let one difficult moment decide how you see yourself. Most people are carrying gifts the world has not discovered yet." The young server smiled with renewed confidence and continued walking. Perhaps years from now, she would remember those words when someone else needed encouragement. That is how dignity travels. It moves quietly from one life into another until entire communities begin to change. Some people believe that evening had been about a language, a wager, or a business deal worth millions of dollars. They were mistaken. It was never about money. It was never about proving who was smarter. It was about recognizing the extraordinary value hidden behind ordinary appearances. Ethan entered the restaurant believing wealth gave him the power to measure another person's worth. He left understanding that character cannot be recognized by uniforms, titles, or first impressions. Sometimes the wisest voice in the room belongs to the person everyone else forgot to notice. And on that unforgettable evening, respect stood up long before anyone else did.